Welcome. And of course, we'll start out with our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
We'll get into the screen share. Here we are. So as I was looking for the place where we were from last year, it was interesting. I looked at the recording and it said, God willing, we'll pick up here. And here we are. Apparently, I'm happy to say that God was willing. So the Parsha, of course, is va'Eyra. And at this particular point, Moses is now coming to Pharaoh. And we are going to start the process of the 10 plagues. And just by way of perhaps introduction, although it's something that's occurred to me this year, is the idea of the 10 plagues and the whole thing with Pharaoh and the slavery, the enslavement of the Israelites to Pharaoh from a literary point of view as representing our addiction. That slavery and addiction are one and the same. And that in a way, we're talking here about the process of extracting oneself from addiction and just how difficult it really is. And that in some ways, Pharaoh's responses at this particular point are typical of how we react emotionally when we are told or we realize that we are addicted and we're trying to pull ourselves out of it. One is to say, well, it's really not that bad, that we're really not addicted, or that we deny it altogether, just like Pharaoh's denying God, and then to see the plagues. And this is just, of course, a very preliminary and superficial understanding of this, using this as a metaphor literally. And that is that the 10 plagues represent the fact that so often addictions bring with them really awful situations, and we just don't want to. We may listen to them for a little bit, we may take them to heart briefly, but then we're back in our addiction again. And that this is just such a marvelous description of something that is a very human condition, because I'll go out on a limb and say that I suspect that every one of us, every human being, encounters addiction of some kind, and that being able to be liberated from that addiction is a wonderful, wonderful moment in human development. So just something to think about. That certainly makes this very relevant, and again, brings this whole story moving away from assuming that it's history, assuming that that's biblical, a biblical attempt to be scientific or anything like that, and to realize this is not what we're talking about. Not to say that there may be no history involved, may well have a level of historicity. Not to say that there may be elements that could be even considered quote scientific, but to the extent that science is a naturalism, right? That in a sense you could look at science, and this I learned just recently from reading the Heschel book, Between God and Man, the idea that in some ways science represents a worship of nature, and what Heschel has to say about that, as opposed to a biblical position which says that while we have a huge respect for nature, we don't worship nature, and we believe that there is something that actually brings nature into existence. So those kinds of thoughts. So moving on. Lech el Paro. So God is speaking to Moses in this context, and he says, Lech el Paro baboker, go to Pharaoh in the morning. Hine yotze hamaima. Behold, he is going out to the water. V'nitzavta likrato. You shall stand to meet him. al Sfat HaYahor, on the bank of the Nile. Yaor is a word that means river, but specifically here, it refers to the river Nile. It's not really used in any other context than the Egyptian rivers, and specifically the Nile. Bahamateh, and the rod, asher nehepach lenachash, which was turned into a snake, tikach biadecha, you shall take in your hands. And this is a reference back to one of the initial miracles that Moses showed. We've already read about this, how the first time he appears to Pharaoh, they takes the rod and it turns into a serpent. And remember, it consumed the rods of the other magicians. They did the same kind of thing. And that's what we're referring to here. So, rod, remember, you think of a rod, you think of a scepter, and the idea of enforcing control. I believe that's what a rod represents, just as the hand represents control. And notice how it is. Let's look at this. Right. Okay. You shall take in your hand. Right. So we're talking about enforcement here. That's the rod. That's the idea of the scepter. Let's take a look at the Rashi here. Hine Yotze Hamaima. So again, what's the issue here? What's the need for this particular phrase, especially since the rest of the sentence says you should meet him on the bank of the Nile? Obviously, he is going out. What do we mean? What's the point of the sentence? So, Lin Kavav. So, in other words, he's going to relieve himself. Shahaya oseh atzmo Eloha, because he'd make himself out to be a god. Omer, and he would say, She'enot tzarich linkavav. And he'd say, well, I'm a god, so I don't need to pay a call of nature. I don't need bio breaks. Right? Umashkim v'yotze lanilus. And so he'd get up extra early and go to the Nile, v'oseh sham tzorchav. And there he would pay attention, take care of his needs. So again, interesting observation here. And I was thinking about this, about the point that's being made and that Rashi's drawing from the text. And this is actually from Shemot Rabbah. So you understand, whenever I say Rashi, it's like, well, it's not that Rashi's coming up with this himself. It's that he's chosen this from this amount, this encyclopedic knowledge that he has and all this material that he's learned. And so this is from Shemot Rabbah. So again, what did the rabbis, what did the tradition, what was the point that the tradition was trying to make? And my sense is the fact that we look even nowadays at certain behavior of very powerful people, and they start to think of themselves as God. And in a way, the fact that we all have to, if we're capable of it, and if we can't, we're in deep trouble, to take care of our biological needs, our needs to be able to, to take care of ourselves and to get rid of the waste in our system, right? We're not gods. We're not perfectly pure. We have to process everything, and we also have to do something that, frankly, is very humbling and something that we'd rather do in private for most of us. I think under normal circumstances, it's a very human, mortal kind of behavior. And that in some ways, for people to realize that as powerful as they are, as wealthy as they are, as much as they feel they control the world, they're still human beings. And that very important lesson that we are all mortals, regardless of what station we may have achieved in our lives. We nevertheless we're not God. And that perhaps that's what's coming out of all of this. And the very fact that he had to act surreptitiously, right? He had to do that in order to try and convince him. And is that sort of saying to ourselves that we deceive ourselves when we start thinking in that particular way? Just some of the things that come out of this interesting observation here on the text.
So does that also mean that Pharaoh didn't eat, right? Because if I mean,
Yes.
literally, if
Uh,
you're going that extreme,
yes.
right?
Yes.
Anyway, just curious.
I love your question. Thank you. So the point is that when people made sacrifices to gods, that had the idea of eating and simply being able to consume that and have it, because of course, you know what happens to the food, right? It becomes our part of our bodies. It gets absorbed into our bodies. And I think the fact that eating is actually something celebratory, right? Think to yourself, what do we associate with eating, right?
Mm-hmm.
Comfort, celebration, uh, um, oh gosh, socializing, etc. Whereas going to the bathroom is essentially a very private matter, and I think that's where this is coming from as to why, even though what you're saying is logical, right? But I think it again has to do with the associations and the metaphoric associations that we'd have with feasting and banqueting and stuff like that. And again, think of the bacchanalia that was going on, and the idea again of you know doing these things essentially the emotional connection between eating as opposed to going to the bathroom. So
No,
that's why
I get. Yep,
I think he would certainly have banquets, and that would not be considered a question as to his divinity.
got it. Okay, yeah, I was just curious. That makes sense. That makes
Well,
sense.
well, I'm so glad you asked it because I think what happens is you brought out something. Honestly, David, I have to say I never would have thought of that until my response to you is directly a response to the fact that you asked that question and essentially forced me to try and think carefully as to why and what's the difference because it's such a great question. So thank you, seriously.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So Um, so going on to the next sentence, Va'amarta Elav, and you shall say to him, again, remember God speaking to Moses, Hashem Elokei Ha'ivrim, right? The Lord, if we want to translate it that way, right? The God of the Hebrews, Shlachani Elecha Lemor, has sent me to you to say. And now comes, of course, one of the phrases that I love to riff on because it reminds me of the fact that people hear only part of what's being said. And what is he saying? So first of all, there's something to think about in the fact that God is giving him that authority, right? The idea that he is telling Pharaoh the authority on which he's saying this to him. And the whole idea that even when you're Pharaoh, you're still answerable to a higher level of power, right? The essential I would say, modesty, right? That we need to carry ourselves around with and not to forget that. At any rate, shlach et ami, send forth, right? Send forth my people, right? Let my people go, right? V'ya avduni bamidbar, so that they may serve me in the wilderness. And I love to say that everyone hears, let my people go, and they don't hear that they may serve me. They don't hear that part. That the essential freedom was in order to serve God and to understand, and this is the subtle point that escapes a lot of people, is that serving God actually is freedom, that the ability to choose, right, to choose to serve the creator of the universe is perhaps the greatest liberating act we can do. But people don't hear this. They only hear send, let my people go. And they think it just means, that you have license. And we don't. right? Or if we act with license, as if we have the license to do whatever we like, we actually wind up enslaving ourselves. Just to finish the sentence, and then I want to go back a little bit and give you a modern, and forgive me if I'm entering a little bit into politics, but anyway, Vehine lo shamata ad ko, and behold, you have not heard. You have not listened to me. You haven't paid attention ad ko until thus far. That's how we translate it. It's interesting. Point that I'm making is that there was a slogan in a previous election about draining the swamp in Washington. And my point about that is it's one thing to drain the swamp. The question is, what are you replacing it with? And I felt that, forgive me, and this is my political statement, and I will replace it with a cesspool.
And
So,
where did the swamp water go?
yeah,
That's my question.
well,
Where
my
does the
point is,
swamp water go?
well, that's fine. But the point is that if it's in Washington, the
Yeah,
assumption being, of course, is that these are the
I know.
people who are governing the country, and I'm replacing it with something worse. But they don't, they just hear draining the swamp. It's like people who want to leave, right? There's this emotional thing that you're in a bad situation and you want to leave, want to get out of that situation, but you don't think to yourself, this is the point I think you're making, Golda, which is, so where am I going to go? What's the new situation going to be like? And we don't think that through, or unless we've trained ourselves. It takes training to do that. My point here, of course, on this classic biblical line is let my people go that they may serve me. And to understand that that little phrase, that they may serve me. And let's go a little bit further. Maybe we can tease this out a little bit more, deconstruct it a little bit more. In the wilderness. So that context, right? They may serve me in the wilderness. And I think the rabbis have commented, the early rabbis have commented on that. In other words, in some ways, in order to serve God, you have to look at all your comfort, your creature comforts, and everything as a wilderness, and realize that that the association that we have with a wilderness, in that we don't have control over it, or that it doesn't provide us with our creature comforts, etc., is we have to be able to, in other words, we have to be able to, in some ways, push away things that we rely on that are materialistic, that we have to be able to get away to some extent from the materialism that we may wallow in. And again, it's not a question of being ascetic, right? Giving up all material pleasures. We're not asking for that. It's more a question of balance and recognizing where that balance actually lays. Let's take a look at, sorry, you're getting a lot of sermons today. Okay. All right, let's take a look. Ad kol, yeah, the end of that sentence. Up until now. And this word kol, right? So he says ad hena. In other words, and up to this point, right? You haven't paid attention. You haven't followed what I've told you to do up to this point. And now Rashi shares a wonderful midrash, midrasho, and the midrashic understanding of this text. This isn't a literal interpretation. This is a literary interpretation, right? Ad until shetishma mimeni makat bechorot. You're not going to pay attention to me until we get to the plague of the striking of the firstborn. Makat Bechorot refers to the slaying of the firstborn, the 10th and last plague. And so, in a way, understanding this kol, how does he get that? He says, and he explains, She'eftach ba b'kol, because I am going to introduce that plague when I come and warn you about it. I'm going to introduce it with the words kol. Ko amar Hashem, thus saith Hashem, Kechatzot halayla, at around midnight, which is when this took place. And sometimes, of course, we have to end, we will keep hurting ourselves until we get to a point of midnight, right? Things are black. And then sometimes we can get out of it. We can try to finally look for a solution. So some really profound stuff going on here. Okay. So then, and look at this, we have a repetition of this word. So he does repeat this here. And this, of course, is going to be the plague of the very first plague, which is the Nile, of course, turning into blood. And it occurred to me, or occurs to me, that in some ways that's a foreshadowing of the death of the firstborn. By the way, he is told this. Moses did warn Pharaoh about this already in a previous conversation where he talks about Pharaoh's firstborn and Israel being God's firstborn. And that if Pharaoh does not relinquish God's firstborn, his own firstborn, he will have to relinquish. So, at any rate, this thus, right? Amar Hashem. So the blood, of course, is that foreshadowing. Amar Hashem, thus saith Hashem, bezot teda. In this way you will know, ki ani Hashem. Remember, Pharaoh even denied God's existence, right, in that earlier conversation. You will know that I am Hashem, that I am in fact Adonai, right? And the implication of Adonai meaning that all of reality is, was, will be, that all of reality is embodied here. Okay. Okay. Hine, behold, Anochi makeh b'mateh. I will strike with the rod, asher biyadi, which is in my hand, al hamayim, on the water. And we know that water is such a necessary ingredient to life itself, right? Abba Ibn, in his work about civilization and the Jews, makes the point that civilization itself was impossible until people were able to create a reliable source of water throughout the year, that they were no longer forced into the life of nomads, and that civilization basically means the life of cities. And cities are only possible when you have a reliable water supply. So to this day, right? I'm going to strike the water, asher b'yaor, which is in the Nile, v'nehepchu ladam, and they will be changed into blood. So, the first of the plagues. Let's see, I think actually, yep, here we go. V'nehepchu ladam, and they will change into blood. Lefi, and Rashi explains why this is so significant as to the fact that the waters of the Nile are changing to blood. And he explains, Lefi she'en geshamim yordim mitzrayim. Point is that rain doesn't fall in Egypt. There's no rainfall in Egypt. V'nilos olah, and the Nile floods its banks. We know this, right? This is exactly why civilization took place in Egypt, because they were able to create a reliable water supply based on the flooding of the Nile every spring. Umashke et haaretz, and it waters the land. Umitzrayim ovdim lanilas, and as a result, the Egyptians worshipped, right, served the Nile. They worshipped the Nile. Lefichach, and for this reason, Hilka et et yiratam. And for this reason, God struck the one they feared. In other words, their God. It's a synonym for God, the one they worshipped. V'achar hilka otam. And after that, he struck themselves. So part of the idea of this is understanding the insidious nature of idolatry, and recognizing and understanding the nature of idolatry, and what we mean when we talk about idolatry. which is essentially the belief in the ultimate power of a particular element of our lives, other than a transcendent creator. That's idolatry. And of course the Bible and Judaism trying to get us to give up that belief, that kind of belief. So I'm going to stop here and put the marking in, and we'll take a look. So understand that what's happening here is that Moses, under God's authority and with God's commandment, is warning Pharaoh about what's going to happen. And of course, sadly, Pharaoh doesn't seem to really care about that. Let me stop the share. And does anybody want to make any comments before we go off record? Any thoughts? Yep, David.
Yeah. So with the phrase, let my people go so that they may serve me in the wilderness, I guess my question here is, in terms of the aspect of slavery, is it considered, is it slavery because, it's one human being enslaving and, enslave or bringing somebody to do, into servitude that they don't want to, or it's because they're a human being, or is it because of the choice aspect associated with it? Because, we serve God, but we serve God, it's out of choice, right? And maybe it's both. I'm just trying to understand, the if it's because it's a mortal, asking him or having a mortal do something against their will, or it's because of the aspect of choice, or a combination thereof. What defines, the difference between serving and slavery in this case?
I see what you're saying. Well, I think in this particular case, it's the idea of understanding that the difference, because we all serve. In other words, we have to make a livelihood. And in order to make a livelihood, if we are in that position, we have to serve a boss, okay, something else. So why aren't we slaves? So the idea is that when you're a slave, you are actually owned by that other person. That being a slave means you have no, even though we may serve others in order to make a livelihood, we aren't slaves because we aren't owned. Our bodies, our very existence isn't owned by another person. So I think that's part of the idea there. I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but I think the idea that one person has the right to do this kind of thing. I mean, certainly we have some, I would say ambivalence regarding the monarchy, period, and the institution of the monarchy. You see that in Samuel very clearly, and yet, and I'm saying it's a genuine ambivalence because on the other hand, we speak with a great deal of love and pride in the idea of the house of David and the idea of, the Messiah. The whole concept of a Messiah is of a human king, but nevertheless that king also has to serve God. And we're not slaves to that king, but it still gives any governmental authority, and certainly a monarch, huge power over controlling our lives. But it doesn't, but there's some difference. They still don't own us. That idea,
Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. So basically, right. Because, God, in some sense, we've talked about, you mentioned this before, does own us, right? We owe our existence to God.
Right.
We have a lease on life. All
Right.
those aspects. So it's really around the idea that, one human being, quote, owning another in that sense.
Right.
And
Right.
that's the point that you're making. And, yeah. Okay. That helps. I was just trying to get the distinction or understand the distinction. Thank you.
And again, how obnoxious that is. And that we see that even though slavery, quote, is an institution that the Bible talks about, the treatment of those slaves is still something that's of great concern, and not abusing that idea. And the other piece is that even within Israelite society, remember the maximum amount of time was essentially 6 years, 6 years. And incidentally, the rabbis interpret that all that biblical stuff to indicate that when we're talking about that, and we'll get to that in Parshat Mishpatim, by the way. I think we've already had some lessons about it, right? That it has to do with a court that was, quote, selling someone to pay for their theft.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a very narrow situation that we talked about that. I mean, the part that's disturbing, I would say, is the idea that non-Jews can in fact become slaves, right, in the sense of ownership. But at the same time, there's great concern about about the treatment of such people who are in your control. And I'd like to think, because as I said, I find it disturbing, is that the Torah is trying to be able to show a path by which human beings won't enslave other human beings. And again, the rabbis often talk about the Dibra Torah Bilshon or Kilshon Bnei Adam, that the Torah tries to use the language of common human language. And I understand by that saying that if the Torah isn't speaking in exalted tones, it's because we don't want to go to such an extreme where the Torah is up in heaven and we all pay lip service to it and say, oh yeah, it's all right, but we don't do it. That's the problem. So you want to try and express, when you're trying to actually make a legal system out of this in a way that human beings can absorb and accept and start to eventually change. But I truly believe that the Torah and Judaism really does not like and support the idea of slavery, even though the Torah itself, that is the literal Torah, talks about it as an institution. But in that sense, we do have to contextualize what's being said there. But it's very important to me, to whatever degree I can, to show how the Torah is extremely relevant, to current affairs and how we behave now. And look at in our own country, in the United States, right? The level of bigotry that still it hangs on. It's so strong, and trying to teach people not to behave that way, to try to teach people the laws of kindness. It's so hard. It is so hard, and for so many complicated psychological reasons. So
Yep.
again, if we're going to try and bring heaven down to earth, which is what I think we're trying to do, that to me is the symbolism of the Ten Commandments coming out of heaven and being brought down to earth. That's what we're trying to do. We don't want to practice lip service. We want to try and make it a reality. So,
and I think it's also fair that, I mean, to your point, that the Torah is evolutionary, right? So it describes and helps us on an evolutionary path, right? So acknowledging, what happens on it, or enabling it to help us on a daily basis, allows us to evolve into, better people, better selves, whatever. Yeah. So that makes, yeah. So thank you for describing all that.
Well, no, thank you also for putting and introducing that sort of idea of evolutionary, which I love. I really do. I think it's true. It shows a slower, deeper process. Okay, we'll stop here. Thank you.